used appropriately. And this is another argument, that the Geneva Convention is already regulating the use of mines because it regulates what is the appropriate use of any particular weapon during war or the inappropriate use. And if we conclude that Geneva Convention principles confine what would be the appropriate and inappropriate use of mines, then we can say that Geneva Convention constrains what is okay and not okay as far as where you can put mines, how you use them, etc. And one thing that people say is that smart mines can be developed. Those are mines that expire after some period of time, so they self-destruct on their own. And this, they say, is something that could respond to the idea that mines will not respect the cessation of conflict, which again is a principle of the laws of war and international law, is that after a conflict, the militaries must respect that cessation of conflict. But if mines are still around and people are still getting killed by them, then they don't respect the cessation of conflict. Well, the opponents of the supporters of mines say you can get around this by having smart mines, ones that self-destruct. Well, let's see. I think there are plenty of arguments against that idea. One is simply that not every country is going to have the technology to implement these smart mines. Only perhaps the United States is going to have the technology and so forth to do so. So if the United States and other countries that want to actually implement those kinds of mines do so, won't they be encouraging other countries to produce mines, deploy mines, but perhaps not ones that are so smart? And then, of course, you're going to have the same situation where civilians are getting killed and so forth. So one of the things here is that while the United States might argue that it can apply mines appropriately in certain exceptional circumstances, with certain nuances that respect the Geneva Conventions, the problem is that mines have killed thousands of people over the years, and why would we want to encourage other countries potentially to be using them without the same kind of nuance and appropriate distinctions and so forth that the United States is doing? Perhaps we don't, and that would be why an international ban might be appropriate. And this also goes to another point, which is that if you have an international ban, there's a certain level of quality across the board in terms of everybody being at the same level of military ability. Well, of course, maybe the United States wants to be super advanced in its military abilities and so forth. But as far as certain things go, it might be appropriate to keep mines at the same level. Of course, the United States can develop its military in other ways, certain advantages, those advantages will be maintained, high-tech airplanes, tanks, certain weaponry, guns, all the kinds of things that can be used in a discriminating way, that is, to avoid civilians and make sure that you're consistent with the Geneva Conventions, cessation of conflict, other things. Another point is that in conflict, landmines can actually be bad for the country that plants them. So that is, for example, in the Gulf War, this is in 1991. The United States had planted mines in Iraq apparently before the conflict. This was, I think, during the Iran-Iraq War, and then during the Persian Gulf War, its troops had to contend with the mines that it had actually planted in years past. So this is one argument. You lay mines, maybe in years in the future, you come back and you actually suffer from them. Another point, though, is that let's say during a single conflict, you lay mines down, and then you're flanked by, let's say, an opposing military force, and your troops are forced to cross that landmine field that you just laid down. There are all kinds of issues in regards to how your mobility as a military force can be maintained when you have just laid down a minefield. And this actually is very relevant in a real situation in North Korea. So let's imagine that the North Koreans launch a major ballistic missile as well as artillery bombardment of Seoul in South Korea. And then the United States decides and South Korea decide that they need to launch a counterattack with actual military force, tanks, etc. across into North Korea. How are they going to do that necessarily if they've laid all these mines down on the border? Now, maybe they've already planned for this, but the point is that it does limit a certain level of counterattack ability and mobility from the troop that actually laid them, the force that actually laid them down. A little bit more detail on the North Korea situation, because this is precisely what is preventing the United States from joining the treaty. So in North Korea, the whole idea, and again, this is on the border, the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, between North Korea and South Korea. The whole idea is that landmines will prevent North Korea from launching some kind of a blitzkrieg attack against South Korea. There's definitely